Many of you may remember Darnella Frazier for her compelling testimony during the George Floyd trial. And if you didn't tune in for that, you definitely saw the footage that she captured when George Floyd took his last breath. It reverberated around the world and is really what is responsible for the global response to George Floyd's murder. Darnella Frazier at the time was just a 17-year-old girl who was taking her 9-year-old cousin to the corner store when she saw Derek Chauvin with his knee on George Floyd's neck. And she had the wherewithal, some even calling her a citizen journalist, stopping and pulling out her phone and recording a video. It was 8 minutes and 46 seconds. During the trial, we learned that that incident actually took place for even longer, 9 minutes and 29 seconds, in fact. But it was the 8 minutes and 46 seconds she captured on her cell phone that made the world come out and stand up for George Floyd's humanity. And now that 17-year-old girl, she's a little bit older, but here in Minneapolis, we've learned that a high-speed chase by the Minneapolis Police Department, they were pursuing a robbery suspect, ended up crashing into an innocent bystander who happened to be her uncle. And so here she is, plagued with yet another loss, another traumatic incident at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department. Ben, and I'm not sure if Carl Mack is here with us now, but I wanted to center this at the top of the day because, you know, what we're seeing in Minneapolis here, the epicenter of this global movement following the death of George Floyd, what we're seeing here, even this incident taking place on the 5th anniversary of Philando Castile being killed by police here in Minnesota. And so this issue, as much as we try to turn the other cheek and say, you know, maybe 2 or 3 bills that were passed on a state level is sufficient, we're continuing to see this issue of police negligence and lack of accountability come to the forefront, and not just in Minnesota. This is something that's happening across the nation.
You know, this is the degrees of separation of trauma in this country is entirely too close now. For this young woman to have captured one of the most traumatic experiences that we collectively as Americans have experienced in having to watch those minutes, those 8 minutes, and then for her to turn around and then to suffer at the hands of this tragedy that is the result of yet police violence. Because as she stated in her post, why would they be doing this chase through a residential neighborhood? And it's just so traumatic being black in this country. It is so traumatic being black on this planet. But for this young sister to suffer this, and it's just too much at this point. And, you know, we're definitely sending our thoughts and prayers and condolences to her and her family, and strength and light her way.
You know, and the other thing it makes me think about, Ben, do you recall Katanga Wright? She was the civil rights attorney that we had on a few weeks ago. And here she is 5 years later after Coach Pollard, the baseball coach in Georgia, was killed as an innocent bystander in a high-speed pursuit. She's been trying to pursue justice against the police department in Columbus, Georgia, for a similar situation. And so the question at hand here is, when you are pursuing a suspect, at what time do you set aside the common safety of innocent bystanders in pursuit of one criminal? And in the case of the baseball coach, David Pollard, he was on his way. He had just left school. They had a baseball game that afternoon. He was going out to get chalk for the field. And he ends up getting struck by the vehicle that police were pursuing. And in that instance, that was an individual who had just stolen a vehicle. And so here in that case, you're talking about a used vehicle that's only worth just a few $1,000s.
Yeah.
And you're putting someone's life at risk. And so here in the case with Darnella Frazier, this is a woman who has endured gross trauma. Now having to relive that, you know, and seeing the harm that was perpetuated against George Floyd by a Minneapolis Police Department officer, and now MPD is responsible for claiming the life of her uncle. And for what? in pursuit of someone who robbed a few businesses. And I'm not trying to minimize the crime here at all. What I'm trying to do is value the life. And so why
Right.
is it that our local police departments are continuously disregarding our lives? Continuously disregarding our lives. So now here we have another family who is grieving, and they're going to be seeking justice from the Minneapolis Police Department. You know, at some point, we really have to look at, it's not just about police accountability. There has to be some serious changes with the way that these officers are trained in to make decisions. Because if your first mind is to get the criminal and forget everybody else, we are living in a very, very dangerous society.
Very, you know, and I think that's the crux of it. Georgia, I think that we need to understand that this country is violent, and violence begets violence. And the violence that we have externally is the violence that we're seeing internally. And I'm not trying to wax poetically or anything. Like, it's just a matter of fact. What we see America doing on the global stage is what we see reflected domestically. And we have a level of violence here that I think we become desensitized to. I mean, we spoke yesterday about the 150 lives that were taken over the weekend, over the 4th of July weekend, and we become numb to it. And I don't say that to insult us who have had to cope and compartmentalize. I say that because when you look at the trauma that America lays at the feet of Black people in this country, it's a lot. It's a lot. And I'm thinking of Sister Darnella Frazier particularly.
Absolutely. You mentioned the 150 fatalities over the weekend. I want to bring in our guest, Dr. J, who's here with us to speak about gun violence this morning. Before we pivot, I want to zero in on this issue. It's easy to look at the large numbers and kind of disregard them, right? But when you understand the people who are behind those numbers, there was a 6-year-old girl. Her name is Anaya Allen. She was shot in the head while she was sitting in the back of a vehicle eating McDonald's. Take a listen to what her grandfather had to say as he continues to call out the person responsible for her murder.
I got a whole new fight now, and I'm not going to stop. And it may cost me my life. It may cost me my life, and I'm ready for that. I'm prepared for that, and I told my family, but they know me, you know. And so I'm on the front line. I am there. I'm not going to stop until I drop or they take me, trying to. If they watch it, because I think anything I say or do now, those who shot the 3 children are watching. And I'm going to say to them again, turn yourself in. Make it right with God, the community, and our families, these 3 families. Turn yourself in.
That is peace activist KG Wilson. And you heard him there not only talk about his 6-year-old granddaughter, but you also heard him talk about 2 other children. Trinity, who was 9-year-old, who was shot in the head and also died from her injuries. And then LaDavion, who is still fighting for his life. Those are just 3 children, right? And then over the weekend, 150 fatalities across the country, 400 shootings. Dr. J, this feels like a very complex issue because it's not just about, you know, gun restrictions, putting those in place to prevent this from happening. It's also about attacking the root of gun violence, which a lot of people attribute to poverty and lack of resources. Do you have any ideas that can help us start to understand what types of preventative measures can we put in place to mitigate this level of violence from continuing to occur across the country?
Yes, thank you. There's a lot that we can do. And I'm glad that you mentioned the root causes because that's where we need to look. Some of the interventions that are getting the most attention now involve having community members, people who are credible messengers in the places most impacted by gun violence, be involved in reaching out to the people who are most at risk of being themselves impacted by violence, either because they have been injured or we know they're involved in ongoing disputes, and making sure that they get access to the services they need, access to jobs and other opportunities, to counseling, because trauma is so deeply involved in the processes that produce violence. And also, sometimes those individuals can intervene to resolve disputes or at least sort of cool things down as things heat up.
And then in this case, we're seeing, at least for these three children specifically, where the murder suspect is still on the loose. We've talked a lot about the no snitching culture and how that can play a role in people refusing to turn individuals in. Is there anything that you can say to speak to the dire need that our community has for people who know something, and someone knows something? Someone knows something about these three children. Someone knows something about those other 150 fatalities in the cases where the murder suspect is still on the loose. Is there anything that you can say to speak to that aspect of either the investigation or just the need for people to stop being complicit and speak up when they know something?
Well, I think, as you say, this is quite a complex issue. And as you were saying earlier, there's a lot of reasons that we need to think deeply about the role of policing in community safety. So one argument in this space is if police departments were less involved in some of the activities that you described earlier, the proactive sort of making contact with people on the street, which we know disproportionately affects youth of color, especially Black youth, has mental and physical health effects, that police could be then more focused on investigating incidents of violence, and that it might contribute to better community trust. But that is a very complicated issue, and it's something that I think it's not fair just to put on impacted community members to improve trust and relations with police departments. It needs to go both ways.
Absolutely. And Ben, I want to invite you to ask Dr. J a question. I know we've talked about the complexities of this issue. Really quick, first, Dr. J, you're leading on this issue. You're an expert in this area. What are the things that we should be thinking about when we are talking about this subject and approaching the subject?
Well, one thing that we see with the mainstream media is a really high level of attention to what are sometimes called mass shootings in public spaces, so that some of the audiences that I talk to have this vision in mind of gun violence, which involves a young white man in his 20s or 30s going into a space and trying to kill strangers. But that represents a very tiny sliver of this gun violence problem in America, the vast majority of which affects communities of color, especially Black communities, and is driven by structural racism. So the concentrated disadvantage that we map onto race and ethnicity in the US. And what my lab has found in our research is that in addition to the pre-existing disparities across race and ethnicity, disproportionately affecting Black and Hispanic youth in their exposure to gun violence, those disparities have only gotten worse during the pandemic. So this is an urgent issue. It's a racial justice issue, and reinvesting in communities that have been disinvested from over many years is how we start to address those root causes.
You know, I think this is I think we have an opportunity to expose something here, because the general sentiment in the discourse, at least from our establishment, is that, the police, that they are they keep us safe. But if we look at the over-policing in our inner communities and look at the type of violence that exists in our inner communities, something's not right there in terms like if that was true, then Black communities should be the safest because we're the most over-policed. Could you speak to that?
I agree with you, and there's not much evidence that policing as it's traditionally practiced, or even some of the sort of newer strategies that police departments employ, that is particularly effective in preventing the most serious forms of violence. So I think this is a moment when we need to very seriously think about all of the alternatives that we have, particularly ones that don't impose additional traumas on communities, but in fact have the opposite effect of starting to heal and support the resilience of communities that already have had to be very resilient, more resilient than they should need to be because of the way that we've disinvested from them.
And in that disinvestment, the conversation with some of our friends like Jim Clyburn, and not to pull you into any of the politics of it, but just in the logic of it. Underneath it, they're saying that it's absurd to consider defunding the police. But as I hear you saying, our communities have been defunded. The resources in our communities have been defunded. And it's because of the lack of resources in our communities that we see this type of violence as compared to the amount of money we are spending on policing agencies across this country.
It's absolutely critical, no matter what, that we increase funding to the kinds of social services that people need, to education, healthcare, local community nonprofits. I mean, there's groups in every community affected by violence that are already working on this, have been working on it for many years, and could do much more with more resources. So I think that's the way that I look at the funding side of this. In addition to the physical infrastructure, I mean, we know that there is a specific, this is the focus of my research, there's a specific association between physically disordered, disinvested, physical urban environments and gun violence. So a vacant lot that becomes overgrown with weeds and doesn't feel safe to walk past, or an abandoned building, those places contribute to violence above and beyond the local levels of poverty and all the other factors. So addressing those kinds of factors we need to think about those kinds of investments as well.
Absolutely. Dr. J, we want to thank you so much for joining us this morning. Ben, I know that you had some breaking news that just came in. If we can take a moment here to pivot to that.
Yes, and again, Dr. J, thank you, because I think one thing that I want us to consider in this conversation about gun violence is the fact that we see this not only domestically, we see it globally. And I'm just looking at the situation out of Haiti, and we're going to be talking about that extensively coming up in the second hour. But the situation in Haiti where the president, Jovenel Moïse, was assassinated last night in his home, according to a statement released by the Haitian prime minister. There is video footage of what they believe to be the assailants. And we will be getting that video and making sure that obviously that there's nothing graphic in it. And we'll be sharing that with you throughout the day. We're also going to be speaking, obviously, with Rebecca Azor. She has been covering the unrest in Haiti for some time, the protests, the massive protests that have been taking place in light of President Moïse refusing to concede power there in Haiti. So we're going to be covering this extensively throughout this morning. And it's just, Georgia, it's just a really violent time for Black people all across the globe. And I directly see it tied to the violence that we see at home.
You know, it's interesting that you made that connection and drew out those parallels, because I see them also specifically in the protesting. Because really, at the essence, when you go out and you're boots on the ground, you're interviewing protesters, whether it's here, Haiti, or anywhere else across the world, the common denominator is usually liberation. People are fighting for their own liberation. People are standing up and saying that they feel oppressed. And I mean, it was so interesting because simultaneously, while there were a lot of protests continuing to happen in Minneapolis for George Floyd, the Oromo community, which I was not really tapped into here in Minneapolis, they were taking to the highway with their flags, and they were protesting and standing in solidarity with what was happening in their home country. And so we're seeing this all across the world, people standing up against oppression. And so the larger question then is about the government agencies that are in place, people speaking out in the ways in which they feel their government agency is controlling them, or limiting their freedom, or just oppressing them altogether. And I know that you followed the situation in Haiti more often. Is that also true for what's happening there as well?
You know what is fascinating, pardon me, about this story. One of the details that I know that we're going to go into is that the assassins announced themselves as DEA. The Department of Enforcement, now it escapes me exactly what it stands for, but the U.S. Department, the Drug Enforcement Agency, thank you. And in that, it gives the impression that this was a U.S.-backed assassination, but the irony of it is that Moise was backed by the United States. And this was the point of contention that Sister Rebecca Azor, she's been pointing out that for some time in our coverage here, because it is America's influence there that is problematic to begin with. And so a lot of the unrest that we see not only in Haiti, but across the globe is quite literally because of the U.S. position in that nation. And oftentimes those local governments, for whatever reason, plenty of reasons that we can outline in an entire episode about the connection between seated power in a local government and imperial power. I mean, there are volumes of books that are written about this, but absolutely the case. The people of Haiti, they've been protesting Jovenel Moise for some time now. And so I think that conversation is going to be, we're going to dig into it a lot more when Sister Azor gets on. But it is definitely reflective of American foreign policy and intervention, and not from the way the video tried to describe, though. And I think that's the interesting thing. As the assassins announced themselves to be the Drug Enforcement Agency, everyone rejects that notion pretty roundly, if for no other reason than Moise was a U.S.-backed president.
Well, I really look forward to hearing more from Rebecca Azor. Benjamin Dixon, thank you so much. For those of you watching, you know that these issues are very critical, not just city by city, but across the nation. And now we're seeing even the interconnectedness across the world. So we could go deeper, but we are on the clock this morning. So make sure you guys stick around for more on the Benjamin Dixon Show.